Once upon a time, in a small rural community in Jamaica, there lived a kind-hearted girl named Clara. Clara became an orphan at the young age of 8 after her parents tragically died in a ghastly motor accident. After her parents' burial, she went to live with her elderly grandmother, where they picked up the pieces of their lives and moved forward, finding strength in each other. Months after losing her parents, Clara met a young girl with her parents while shopping for fruits at the local market. She stared, and her mind took her back to the days when she still had her parents, before life dealt her a bitter hand. Days after, Clara was returning from school when she bumped into Willa again. Both girls exchanged pleasantries, and they soon realized they were the same age. They agreed to become friends, and from that day on, Clara and Willa were inseparable. Clara's grandmother was extremely happy to see her granddaughter had finally made a friend, and she no longer saw her cry over the loss of her parents. The years went by fast, and Clara and Willa grew into beautiful young women, two of the most beautiful in their community. All the eligible bachelors sought their hands in marriage, but among all the men, one stood out, Paul. To Willa, she often wished he'd ask her out. One day, while Clara and Willa were hanging out at their favorite spot, chatting away, Paul walked by and approached both girls. To Willa's surprise, Paul asked Clara out. Clara politely rejected him and told Paul that she wasn't interested in dating. He asked if he had done something wrong, to which she replied, "No, you haven't. I'm just not ready to date." Paul expressed his strong feelings for her and said he'd try to change her mind if given the opportunity. Clara laughed and told him to have a nice day. Throughout this interaction, Willa remained silent. The following day, Clara went to their usual spot, but Willa didn't show up. After some hours had passed, Clara became concerned and decided to visit Willa's house to check on her. This was the first time in all the years they'd been friends that Willa had been a no-show. Clara met Willa's parents, who informed her that Willa was feeling ill and resting. Clara asked Willa's parents to extend her well wishes and to tell her best friend that she'd visit her the following day to check on her. She bid them farewell and headed home. The next day, while heading to Willa's house, Clara saw her on the road, looking healthy and hearty. Clara asked her about her health, and Willa responded by saying she was feeling better. Clara asked if they could hang out, but Willa told her she had a lot to do at home and couldn't spend time with her. Even though Clara didn't understand why the sudden change, she agreed and headed home to help her grandmother bake bread. Meanwhile, Willa was waiting at the same spot, knowing it's where Paul walked by each day coming from work. When Paul approached, Willa stopped him, hoping to express to him how much she liked him and wished he'd choose her over her best friend, Clara. But before Willa could say a word, Paul immediately asked her to help him convince Clara to accept him. Willa paused for a moment, holding back her tears, and smiled, agreeing to help Paul win over Clara. Paul thanked her and continued on his way. After Paul left, Willa furiously stormed off, vowing to have Paul by any means. As the weeks and months went by, Clara and Willa's friendship grew increasingly cold. Willa always found an excuse to avoid spending time with Clara. Paul's continuous attempts to win over Clara finally paid off, as she eventually accepted him. They started their relationship, and not long after, they became engaged to be married. When the news of Paul's and Clara's engagement reached Willa, bitterness and resentment seeped into her heart. She pondered to herself, wondering, what is it she has that I don't? It was in that moment she decided to make peace with Clara, knowing that Clara would accept her without questioning anything. Willa had a plan in mind, and she was willing to do whatever it took to achieve it. As Willa predicted, Clara was excited about their reunion and welcomed her warmly. They continued their friendship as if nothing had ever happened. Unbeknownst to Clara, Willa was secretly harboring resentment about Paul choosing Clara over her. 10 years had passed since Paul's and Clara's wedding, and they now had 2 children. Their 9-year-old daughter, Anya, and their 6-year-old son, Vince, brought immense joy to their family. They lived in happiness and peace. Clara had hopes of returning to school to become a certified chef, but she wanted to wait until her children were old enough. Now that the kids were in school, she enrolled in a catering school, and things were moving in the right direction for her. Until one day, Willa showed up at Clara's house for a visit. Clara and her family welcomed her, and Anya and Vince rushed to her as they hadn't seen her in a long time. Ever since that day, Willa had been visiting daily, and unfortunately, that marked the beginning of Clara's misfortune. One day, Paul came home from work drunk and upset, and when his wife Clara approached him to find out how his day was, he lashed out at her. He started accusing her of seeing another man. The once loving and trusting Paul had turned into a suspicious man. Though Clara tried to speak to him to assure him that nothing was happening, he refused to listen to her. Instead, he stormed out of the house and stayed out until late at night, leaving Clara deeply hurt and confused. This repeated itself for some weeks, and the once peaceful home turned into a place of mistrust and quarrel. Things got so bad to the point that Paul would stop eating at home. Clara would often ask him, "Honey, what have I done? At least tell me my crimes so I can apologize to you. Why are you treating me this way?" All of Clara's pleas fell on deaf ears. Until Paul eventually started beating up his wife and threatened her that if she went back to her culinary school, she'd have to leave his house. To keep the peace, Clara stopped going to school, but that didn't stop Paul's aggressive behavior. After several failed attempts to fix their marriage, met with harsh words and curses, Clara reached a breaking point. She went to see her grandmother and confided in her about how Paul was treating her and their children. Paul had stopped providing for them. Clara's grandmother advised her to come back home until Paul came to his senses, but Clara wasn't ready to leave her matrimonial home. The situation had become increasingly challenging for her. 2 days after Clara visited her grandmother, Paul beat her up and then stormed out, leaving her unconscious in their home. Clara's 9-year-old daughter rushed to her mother's side and called out for help. A neighbor came by and rushed Clara to the hospital, where she spent 4 days recovering. After her release, Paul threw her and the 2 children out, denying them as his own and telling Clara to go stay with the children's father. The situation had reached a devastating low point. Clara begged Paul for the sake of their children, but he didn't seem to care. He heartlessly threw them out of the house. Anya, witnessing her mother's anguish, spoke up, saying, "Mommy, let's go to Grandma's house. Daddy doesn't want us anymore." Clara's heart broke as she heard these words from her little daughter. With no other choice, she gathered her 2 children and went to her grandmother's house. It was a heart-wrenching and difficult decision to make. After arriving at her grandmother's house, Clara broke down in tears, overwhelmed by the pain she had endured. Her children ran to their great-grandmother for comfort. Clara's grandmother welcomed her with open arms and reassured her that she would be fine. She also had faith that Clara's husband would eventually come to his senses. It was a moment of solace and support in a time of great distress. After some weeks, Clara's grandmother sat her down and had a heart-to-heart conversation with her. She told Clara that it was time to pick herself up and find a way to earn money so she could send her children back to school. Clara realized that she had been consumed by her broken marriage, but she had 2 young children to care for. She took her grandmother's advice to heart and started to come up with a plan to earn some money to take care of herself and her children. It was a turning point in her journey towards independence and providing for her family. Clara made the decision to start a small business, baking and selling bread in her small community. Even though she hadn't finished culinary school, she had a skill for baking and cooking. As she went to get the necessary permits to start her small-scale business, her grandmother supported her by providing the money to start the venture. Clara expressed her heartfelt gratitude to her grandmother as she prepared for her first day of business. She prayed that she would make some sales to begin taking care of her children. It was a new chapter in her life filled with hope and determination. On her first day, to Clara's surprise, she had sold almost everything, and she was overjoyed as her children came to meet her, accompanying her on the way home. However, on their journey back, some women began mocking Clara, calling her a bad woman and a cheat. They whispered hurtful comments like she doesn't know who her children's father is. Clara hurriedly asked her children to come along, not wanting them to pay attention to the hurtful words the women were saying. She knew that her strength and determination would guide her through these challenges. To Clara's surprise, her best friend Willa was waiting at her grandmother's house for her. This heartwarming reunion made Clara very happy. As they caught up, Clara shared all that had happened, and Willa listened attentively. Willa told her that she had made the right decision in leaving her difficult marriage. She even promised Clara that she would speak to Paul on her behalf. One day, while selling her bread on the street, one of her loyal customers told Clara about a local baking competition where the winners would receive a fully sponsored trip abroad to study in one of the best culinary schools. All the applicants needed to do was provide the enrollment fee. Clara was thrilled to hear about this opportunity, but she couldn't help but feel worried because the money for the enrollment fee was a bit much for her to afford. Clara hurried home and excitedly shared the news about the competition and the incredible prize for being selected as one of the 2 winners with her grandmother. Her grandmother's eyes sparkled with excitement, and she wholeheartedly encouraged Clara to enroll and do her very best. However, Clara also mentioned her concern about not being able to afford the entrance fee. In response, her grandmother assured her that she would do her best to help with the little she had. On the day of the competition, despite her nervousness, Clara performed exceptionally well and emerged as one of the 2 winners. She was overjoyed by her victory, even though she only had a few days to prepare before leaving to study abroad. This was a remarkable achievement and a new beginning for her. After the competition, Clara was bubbling with excitement and gratitude for the opportunity it had offered her. This was a chance to fulfill her lifelong dreams in the culinary world. Shortly after her win, Willa showed up to congratulate her and extended her offer of assistance in any way she could. Clara was appreciative of Willa's kind gesture and asked if she would help her elderly grandmother with her children while she was away pursuing her dreams. She promised to send money back whenever possible for their upkeep. Willa agreed to take on this responsibility, cementing their understanding and support for each other. The day came for Clara to leave for her study abroad, and as she bid her grandmother and children goodbye, her heart was heavy. Willa assured her that she would take care of her children as her own. Tears filled her children's eyes as they clung to her, wishing her well and promising to be strong in her absence. It was a bittersweet farewell, filled with both hope and a sense of loss. Days after Clara left, Willa showed up and asked if she could take Anya and Vin to her home, explaining that it would be more convenient for them to attend school if they stayed with her. And she'd bring them back on the weekend. Clara's grandmother, who had been entrusted with the care of the children, didn't have any objections since Clara had left the children in the care of both her and Clara's best friend, Willa. She agreed to let them stay with Willa for the sake of their education. While on their way, Anya and Vin began to realize that their auntie, Willa, wasn't taking them to her house as they had initially thought. Confused and curious, Anya asked, "Auntie Willa, why are we going to Daddy's house?" Willa told her to keep quiet and then explained to the children that they would be living in their father's house from now on. She revealed that she was now their father's new wife and would be their stepmother. The news left Anya and Vin in a state of shock and uncertainty about the unexpected changes in their lives. The children wept bitterly as they realized that their auntie, Willa, was not the kind and caring person they had believed her to be. They desperately asked to be returned to their grandmother, but Willa heartlessly refused. Paul stood by in silence, not intervening on behalf of his own children. Willa showed the children where they would be staying and told them to get settled because she had many things planned for them in the morning. It was a distressing and bewildering turn of events for Anya and Vin. As the days went by, Anya and Vin found themselves forced to stay at home, doing all the chores and tasks that Willa assigned to them. After finishing their daily chores, Willa would confine them to a shabby, old studio boardhouse in the backyard to sleep. Life became a nightmarish existence for Anya and Vin. They constantly wondered when their mother would return to rescue them from this dire situation. Desperate to escape their grim circumstances, Anya and Vin attempted to run away to their grandmother's house several times. However, Willa's watchful eyes and control over them made it nearly impossible for them to break free. The children were trapped in a distressing and oppressive environment, yearning for their mother's return. 3 weeks after deceiving Clara's grandmother and taking Anya and Vin under the guise that school would be easier to access from her home and they'd see their great-grandmother on the weekend, the mistreatment of Anya and Vin continued. Willa had essentially turned her best friend's children into maids in their own father's house. Paul, who had shown little care for his children, continued to turn a blind eye to all of Willa's wickedness and cruelty toward his own flesh and blood. The situation was a deeply troubling and heartbreaking one for Anya and Vin. One day, while running errands for Willa, Anya seized an opportunity to escape. She managed to sneak back to the house and grabbed her little brother, Vin. Together, they ran to the bus park where they sought assistance to find their grandmother's house. Upon reaching their grandmother's home, Anya poured her heart out, sharing all that had happened. She explained that they hadn't been to school and how their auntie, Willa, had been mistreating them, making them sleep in the old house in the back. Willa would subject them to physical abuse over the slightest provocation, and their father, Paul, seemed to care little for their well-being, asking Willa to send them away. It was in this dire situation that they decided to run away. Their grandmother vowed never to send them back to that dreadful place, determined to do her best to care for them with the little she had until their mother, Clara, returned. A year passed since Clara had left for her studies abroad, and neither her grandmother nor the children had heard from her. Clara had entrusted Willa to care for her children during her absence, sending her money monthly for their upkeep. Each time she inquired about her children, Willa would craft excuses and stories about why they couldn't speak to their mother, adding to Clara's growing concern and worry. It had been a year since Clara heard from her grandmother and her children. She had made several attempts to reach Willa, but her calls went unanswered, leaving Clara worried and eager to speak to her children and her grandmother. She continued to call persistently until one fateful day when Willa finally answered Clara's call. Clara, her voice filled with concern, asked Willa if she could arrange a conversation with her beloved grandmother. However, to Clara's shock, Willa coldly declined, stating that she was no longer her errand girl. Willa went on to inform Clara that her children were with their grandmother, and she wanted nothing to do with them. Before Clara could even respond, Willa sternly told her never to call her line again. In the midst of this tense conversation, Paul, Clara's husband, walked into the room and called out to Willa, "Honey, who are you talking to?" In a panic, Willa immediately disconnected the call, leaving Clara utterly confused about what she had just heard. Clara was left in a state of profound bewilderment, her heart heavy with worry and concern for the fate of her grandmother and children. The sudden and cold rejection from Willa had left her in a state of emotional turmoil. As she sat there, her mind racing, she began to consider whether she should pack her bags and return home to find out what had truly happened to her beloved grandmother and children. One day, while lost in her thoughts, Clara's coursemate noticed her distress and asked her what was bothering her. Clara hesitated but eventually opened up to her. To Clara's surprise, this turned out to be a blessing in disguise. Her coursemate had relatives living in the area where Clara's grandmother resided. She offered to arrange for one of them to pass a message to Clara's grandmother. Clara was immensely grateful for this offer, and within a short time, she was able to speak to her grandmother and her children. As they shared their experiences, they painted a bleak picture of what had transpired in her absence. They recounted how Willa had conspired and tricked them into becoming essentially maids in their father Paul's house, all while Paul stood by and turned a blind eye to Willa's mistreatment. What was even more disheartening was that none of the money Clara had been sending had been used to care for them. It became painfully clear that Willa had completely taken over Clara's position as Paul's wife. Clara's heart ached with a mixture of sadness and anger. She couldn't fathom why her childhood friend would betray her and her own family in such a callous manner. Overwhelmed by all that she had heard about the mistreatment of her children and grandmother, Clara felt an indescribable weight on her shoulders, and the thought of returning home grew even more urgent. "Grandma, I'll come back home. I have some money saved up, and I can open a business for us to survive on. I'll be there to take good care of you and my children." Her grandmother, with a reassuring and wise tone, told her not to let Willa's and Paul's betrayal crush her dreams. She reminded Clara of the strength and resilience that ran in their family. Touched by her grandmother's words, Clara decided to heed her advice. She shared her cell phone number with her grandmother, so they could stay in touch whenever needed. Clara also encouraged her grandmother to open a bank account, promising to send them some money in the next few days to help them in their time of need. With renewed determination and a strong support system, Clara was ready to face the challenges that lay ahead. I hope you enjoyed this story. If you did, please show your support by liking this video, subscribing to my channel, hitting that notification bell, and selecting all, so you won't miss any of my future posts. Stay tuned for part 2 of this gripping story, where the plot thickens and the drama unfolds. Thank you for being a part of our community, and I look forward to sharing more exciting content with you in the future.